And welcome to another tutorial on the dev.java website. So far with the starting with the Java language, we looked at the elements of a Java application, compiling and executing Java code. Now let's look at creating a first Java class. So the first step you need to know is that the Java code you're writing is saved in a plain text file, which means a source file is basically a human readable text file, right? Now, obviously, managed languages like Java or high level languages, they use their own specific extension for the files, for example, .java, because this is the only type of file that Java compiler understands. But in general, if you have worked with the compilers of other languages like C or C++, you know that the extension of the source file doesn't really mean that much. For example, C++ compiler, you can tell the C++ compiler, hey, go ahead and compile all the files that have this particular extension, for example, right? But you cannot tell that to Java C, the Java compiler, because they just wanted to make things simple, right? So Java C only understands .java file. It never looks at other files that don't have a .java extension. But this is not the case, for example, for C++ extensions, C++ programs. So in this tutorial, your application will be written in a single text file. Larger applications may require thousands of such files, and that's about managing your program. That's all about the concept of packages. In a Java package, you group multiple Java classes or multiple Java source codes that are related to each other, and then it's easier to manage those big projects, right? You may have multiple packages, and by default, if you have a class, and basically let me create a class, let's call it my class. So by default, if you give a variable a name, let's say double x, right? By default, this variable has a package level access. As you can see in Eclipse, we have the class, and this triangle, a blue triangle, means it's a package level access, and if it has a white plus in it or white dot, it means it's a field, it's not a method. If I create a method, so double for example get x, and we're going to say that return x, for example. And then what, I didn't specify an access modifier, and you see that now this method also is annotated with a triangle, which means it's a package level access, but it doesn't have this white plus or white dot in it, which means this is a method, right? And what this means is that package level access means you cannot access these outside the package. Only classes in this particular package can directly access these variables. And I can show you if I go to this main class. So let's say var C1 is new my class. So let's create a main class here, and as you can see, I don't need to use any imports. No need to use imports, because we are in the same package. So as long as you instantiate a class which is available in the same package, you don't need to explicitly import it. Now, if this was in another package, then you have to import it. If there was a class with the same name in another package, then you either have to import it or use fully qualified name, so to avoid name collision. So to avoid name space collision or import collision, avoid the import collision, sometimes you have to use the fully qualified name. So sometimes you'll need to use fully qualified name. And by fully qualified name just means the package hierarchy, package 1, package 2 dot eventually the class name, right? This is and inside the Java source code, the separator is dot. Inside the JVM itself, the separator or the path that the JVM needs to find is forward slash, right? But inside the source file, you always use dot for path separator. And remember that these qualifications are all happening with reference to the working directory. So what happens when you launch your Java application, right? So when you launch your Java application, for example, in Eclipse, you always run it from a working directory, whether you run it from the command line terminal or from within Eclipse. Inside Eclipse, so I go to run configuration. As you can see, the working directory by default is the project folder, which makes sense because Inside the project folder, we have the source src folder, and inside the src folders we have the basically our class hierarchies, the packages and classes, right? And then we specify with respect to the source folder, because remember, the source folder doesn't get appended to your working directory. So yeah, so you can check what is your so if you want to see when you launch this, what is the working directory, current working directory for the JVM, check current working directory for the JVM. So I want to see when I launch this application and run this main method, when the execution hits this point, what is my working directory. So I can say a string working directory is system.getProperty. So this is a property, and user dot I believe it's user.dir. Let's check this. sysout working directory. And the current working directory is basically the project folder, right? This is what the Eclipse sets. And because I'm not changing it anywhere in my code, when I hit this point, the current working directory is here. Okay. And so for example, if I save some file, it will save it in the current working directory, which is my project folder at this point, right? And obviously you can't change the working directory because you also have a set property. So let's see if this works. System.setProperty, and it returns a string. So let's say working directory set property, you give it a string key, user directory, and dot just means relative to the current working directory. And or maybe we can just, let's get the fully qualified name of this one. So this is my fully qualified name, and I'm going to set it here. So this is an absolute path to this package. And then we can sys out the working directory again. Let's see what happens here. And as you can see, it didn't change. The reason is that basically this JVM basically disregards this, and Eclipse, or when you launch it, you have to launch the working directory from the, or set the working directory based on the terminal, right? Whatever is passed as the default here. And returns the previous value of the system property. Okay, so I guess this returns the previous value. So we are still looking at the previous value, right? So what we need to do is, let's remove this and say working directory, and now look at the get the property again. Let's launch it, and now as you can see, the working directory for the JVM changed. And in order to see that, I'm going to in order to see that we are actually able to change the working directory, let's create a file, a text file, write something to it, and then save it. So we have this working directory. I'm going to say file or file1, new file, and you can give it a string. We give it a basically test1.txt, right? So whenever you create a file with just the name, it puts it inside the current working directory. So if you don't give the absolute path, I believe it just sets it, it puts it in the working directory. So we're going to create a file writer, fwriter1, new file writer, file1. It takes a file, and we can put this in try with resources, because I believe we have to call the close on it. So try this one, and then fwriter1.write, and then we're going to give it a string testing, and it's going to throw a lot of exceptions here to the surrounding try. Okay, so this is it. And we didn't really need to say fwriter1, because the scope of this try with resources, the scope is limited to the try block, right? So let's run this, and it's done. If I refresh, as you can see, this test1.txt is put inside my current working directory, which was the project. And now let's create the after changing the working directory from the source code, let's see if we can do the same thing. Now I'm using the same file, but or maybe it's better to actually create a new one because the working directory has changed. So test2.txt, file2, and know that fwriter is the same name because the scope of the fwriter inside the try with resources is limited, so it doesn't include the scope outside the try with try block. So if I run this, hopefully we're going to also, the working directory changed. So this new file that I created is now supposed to be inside the working directory, which as you can see, this didn't happen. And let's see what's wrong here. So I believe that's because eventually what we can do here, maybe we can is append the working directory to this one. So instead of this, maybe if we say new file dot forward slash, let's see if this works. No, it still doesn't work. So I leave it as an exercise to you as to why this creation of the file behaves differently. Now what we can do, we can also try to append basically the absolute path. So I create this file with an absolute path. Let's see if this works. And now it works. So I leave it as an exercise to you as to why when you use the file, it always looks at the project folder here, even if I explicitly changes the even if I explicitly change the user directory property. And you can probably guess that that's because the file class doesn't look at this system property, and it looks at something else. So you can figure out. But in the file, you can always use you can either use absolute path or relative path. And the definition of the absolute path in Mac OS and Linux is the string here starts with a forward slash. In Windows, the string, in order for the string to be an absolute path, it has to start with a letter and immediately followed by a colon sign, right? This is for Windows. For Windows, an absolute path starts with a letter and immediately follows with a colon. On Mac OS Linux, a forward slash. A forward slash means if the first character of this string is a forward slash, it means it's an absolute path, Mac OS and Linux, right? So that's how the JVM checks whether the string that you're passing is an absolute path. As you can see here, this working directory starts with a forward slash, which means it's an absolute path. And it's always recommended when you're handling files, always work with absolute path instead of relative path, because then this makes you have confidence on where exactly the file is going to be saved, right? So always try to use absolute path. Java is an object-oriented language, and if you are just starting to learn object-oriented programming, I highly recommend that you start with Java. It's very nicely designed. The design of object-oriented programming in Java is beautiful. Java has obviously some limitation. It doesn't allow operator overloading. So the developers of Java always thought that operator overloading for objects or user-defined object types are confusing. Obviously, if you're doing scientific computing, that's a serious limitations, and that's why programming languages like C++ are usually preferred, or Python even for scientific computing, because if you have a complex number class, you want to treat it as a real number. So you want to be able to say complex number 1 plus complex number 2, use the plus operator, and Java doesn't allow you to do that. That's why for scientific computing, Java syntax becomes a little bit annoying. Although Java is a still very efficient language, and I highly encourage you to try to use it for scientific computing. And there is one case that Java actually allows. Java allows operator overloading, and that's for the case with strings, because first of all, strings are final, so you cannot extend them, so you cannot add your user-defined properties to a string, and that's because strings are final and they are part of the internal API or part of the JDK itself. Developers of Java thought that it makes very much sense to overload the plus operator, right? So when I say a string s1 is hello plus what's up, for example, this is operator overloading because these are two user defined types which are strings, right? And you can even append other variables that are pointing to a strings. For example, here working directory is a string and it still works, right? So this still works and allows you to overload the plus operator. And the reason is that, again, this doesn't contradict the Java's philosophy, because Java doesn't allow operator overloading for user defined classes, because they make things confusing in most cases. But a string is not a user defined class, and it's final, so a user can never extend it and create its own type based on the string. So it makes sense to allow operator overloading for this type of things. And I think strings are an exception to the general rule of not allowing operator overloading in Java. A Java class is created by a special declaration in a text file. Everything in Java starts with a class declaration. The name of your source file must match the name of the class that is inside your source file. Each Java file is only allowed one public class. So only one public class is allowed. You can have multiple classes in a Java source file, that's allowed, but only one of them can be public, and the rest of one will become package level access. So if I create another class, test2 here, this is allowed. But if you look at the annotation that Eclipse compiler puts on it, as you can see, it has a blue rectangle, which means this class is a package level access class. You can never use this or access this anywhere outside this package, right? And this is different from C++. In C++, you just you have multiple classes in a source file, and you can use them as long as you include the header file. But only in Java, only one, in a source file, in a .java file, only one class can be public, and the name of that class must match the name of the source file. So the name of the public class must match the name of the source file. And you can see it. If I right click, obviously I'm using an ID, so things are very easy. If I rename this class to test111, as you can see, Eclipse also renames the source file, the name of the Java file, the source file .java file, because Eclipse already knows that, hey, then this is the only public class in the source file, and its name must match the name of the Java file, .java file. That's why Eclipse automatic. And obviously I use the refactor method. So if wherever I use this test111 class, for example, it's even in the other source files, Eclipse automatically changes them. So in order to show you why this refactoring is very important and why you should use Eclipse, so let's say I try to rename this class. So I say refactor rename, so my class 2, hit enter. Eclipse knows that this is the only public class, so its name must match the name of the Java file, so Eclipse renames. And also wherever I use the original Java name, class name in other source files, it goes and changes them. As you can see, this name is changed. So if you use a plain text editor, the refactoring and renaming is very difficult, right? Especially if you are dealing with a large project. But IDEs are very intelligent and make life much easier. So I highly recommend you use a good IDE for your Java development. Just copy the following code and paste it in your text editor. Congratulations, you have created your first Java code. And again, this is a public class. The name of this Java class must be my first class, which name matches the name of this public class inside your source file. You need to save this text in a file named my first class.java. Again, source files in Java every source file has to have .java extension. The name of the source file .java file must match the name of the only public class in your source file. A Java class must be saved in a file that has the same name as your class with the extension .java. Again, this is not exactly true. The most exact way of saying this is that the public class in your Java source file must be saved in a file that has the name as the name of the basically public class, right? This is mandatory and is in fact very convenient, because you do not need to open a file to know what class is written in. And the other thing that I want to point out is that the way the Java compiler handles this, every class gets compiled and saved as a separate class file. So I want to make it very clear. In a source file, in a .java file, you can have multiple classes, right? Multiple class definitions. But every class definition gets saved as a separate .class file, because JVM, the only thing that it understands is .class files, and each .class file must correspond to only one class. Even you'd have inner classes, which means inside your public class you can define another class. So I can put this class and define it in another scope. Right now I'm defining this class inside the scope of this class. It's pretty much allowed. Eclipse tells me that this is also a package level access. But then if I go to the navigator and look at my bean, let's see how the compiling works. As you can see, what happens here is that basically, let me just maybe I just open it with a text editor. So show in System Explorer, and if I go up src and then if I go to the bean dev.java, and this is my package, and as you can see, what happens here is that you see these dollar signs, and these are the naming conventions that JVM uses. My class 2 was basically first of all, test2 is a separate class. It's its own entity. It's not a public class, but it gets compiled to basically a class, a regular class. So JVM treats it as a regular class, with the exception that it has an access restriction. Its only access level is package level access. Test11 is public, no problem. My class 2 is also public. It's inside its own source file, no problem. But then the inner class, this inner class has a very specific naming, which is the outer class dollar inner class, right? This is how JVM differentiates between the inner classes, the classes that are defined inside the scope of another class. So you can give this class any name as long as it does not start with a number. So with the naming convention of the classes and the source files, it shouldn't start with a number. There is a convention though. The name of the Java class starts with a capital letter, and this is called the Pascal naming convention. So you want to make sure that your classes start with a capital letter. And if you have multiple parts, test2 for example class, you go with the Pascal naming convention, which means the first letter of each part of the name is going to be capitalized. And then this is not mandatory, so you don't need to follow it, but it's a very strong Java convention. But all Java developers follow this convention. When you become a seasoned Java developer, seeing a class that does not follow this convention will look weird to you. It's good to follow the conventions, because those are conventions for a good reason. Those are part of the best practices. If you are following this example to the letter, you should save the my first class in a text file, call it myfirstclass.java. Just a word of warning, you should be using a plain text editor to create and save this file. Using a word processor will not work. You cannot use, for example, Microsoft Word, because Microsoft Word doesn't save as a .java file. It uses its own extension. So a text, some content of text in a Microsoft Word document doesn't mean it's a plain text, right? Because Microsoft Word adds other stuff to it. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we will continue going through all these tutorials. So please stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.